I'm Molly Kimball. Welcome to Fueled, a wellness and nutrition podcast. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition journalist with a passion to help people live their strongest, healthiest life possible. In my weekly TV segments and columns, there's a limited amount of time and space to cover everything, but there's so much more to share. This podcast is my opportunity to dive deeper into the topics you want to know about. Today, we are talking all things keto, the keto diet, ketogenic diet, and what it's all about, what it really is. And a lot of times, spoiler alert, when you hear someone saying that they're going keto, they may not really be doing the true ketogenic diet, but what it really is, potential health benefits, some of the potential drawbacks of it, and giving you the full scoop to see if this is something that you want to incorporate into your diet. So you've probably heard people say they're going keto. I'm hearing it all the time. And they'll say it like that too. They're not saying I'm doing the ketogenic diet. They'll say I'm doing keto or I'm going keto. And odds are you've at least heard someone talking about it if you're not doing it yourself. Or at the very least, you're seeing keto-friendly products in store shelves and recipes, magazines, social media. So what is the keto diet? So keto is short for ketogenic. And basically, it's a diet that's been around for hundreds of years. And it was actually originally designed for children who had uncontrolled seizures that didn't respond to medication. About half of those who followed a classic ketogenic diet had about a 50% reduction in seizures, and about 15% become seizure-free. So very effective as far as altering the brain chemistry that impacts seizures, and especially in kids. So the classic ketogenic diet, the one that is used therapeutically to treat seizures, it is extremely high fat, extremely low carb, and low protein, calling for about a 4-to-1 ratio of fat to protein and carb. So that means 4 parts fat to 1 part protein and carb combined. So by comparison, a lot of the keto diets that people are doing just kind of casually, maybe about a 2-to-1 ratio, depending on what protocol they're using. So much more protein is typically what sneaks in when someone is doing kind of a modified keto diet. But that true ketogenic diet is really crazy challenging, centered on things like oils, whipping creams, sometimes even avocado might be too much carbohydrate to bump out of ketosis when we're looking at it from that true therapeutic effect. So the keto diet ranges, it is not a finite set of numbers that everyone follows the same range. So protein and carbohydrate upper limits can vary, but the general rule of thumb for a keto diet is about 20 to 50 grams of carbohydrate daily, usually leaning closer to that 20 grams daily. And this is about 5 to 10% of total calories for most people. Protein intake is moderate, and the rest of the calories are coming from fat, and that amount of fat consumed is going to vary with appetite and calorie needs. So the science behind the keto diet. Carbs are our body's main source of energy, and since the keto diet is so low in carbs, fats become our primary source of fuel. And when we burn fat for energy, we produce these ketone bodies, and this is why it's called the ketogenic diet. And Dr. Ethan will talk more about this, but ketones can be checked in our urine, our blood, our breath. So when we follow a ketogenic diet, or people who follow a keto diet often use several different measures that they may check for ketones to ensure that they are in fact in ketosis. And research is mixed when it comes to effectiveness of ketogenic diet for fat loss. Some studies show no significant difference, but anecdotally, we've all seen it. People who follow keto diets, they lose a lot of weight. They lose significant body fat in a lot of cases. But as Dr. Ethan and I will talk about, they're often losing a lot of muscle if they're not getting the protein that they need, or they're not doing the strength training to support that muscle mass. So that is one of the drawbacks that I see is when someone is cutting their protein back, they may cut even more than needed. They lose that lean mass, and especially if they haven't been actively engaging muscles, doing strength training to maintain it. So the keto diet isn't something that I personally advocate. It's not something that I encourage people to follow. However, if we have clients come in, they're following the keto diet, we absolutely will work with them to incorporate as many healthful habits, behavior changes, and really start to look at education and lasting behavior change as they're doing this keto diet. And a lot of times they may do the keto diet pretty extreme until they lose some of the excess weight. And then as they get closer to their goal weight, they'll transition back into a little bit more moderate approach. And one of the main advantages of following a keto diet is appetite control. Cutting back on our carbs, making us, resulting us feeling less hungry, also results in a natural reduction in our calorie intake. So that's one of these things that we don't even really feel like we're trying that hard, but we're naturally cutting back our calories because we're curbing those cravings. We're especially curbing those carb cravings when we drop the carbohydrates in our diet. So following that keto diet can help us reduce our cravings. It can help us drop body fat. It also can help with blood sugar control, better cholesterol, better blood pressure, and also reduce inflammation. All of these are likely due to the extra weight loss, as well as keeping those insulin levels suppressed during that keto state. One big thing to note is a lot of people who will think they're doing keto are incorporating so much protein that they may not be actually checking their blood or their urine or their breath for ketones. They've simply cut back their carbs, but they're eating a lot of protein. They're still eating a lot of fats. They might be eating some vegetables, and they may not actually be in ketosis. They're not really doing the keto diet. They're just doing a low carb diet, and that's fine. But a lot of people who will think or say they're doing keto, when you actually kind of dive into what they're doing, they are actually doing just really low carb. So again, fine either way, but just realizing that keto is also a lower protein, low enough that our bodies start to produce those ketones. So here's the rundown of what a keto diet consists of. For starters, very low in carbs, typically 20 grams of carbs or less. And Dr. Ethan and I will talk more about this in a bit, but when you're looking at carbs, carbs come from things like rice, pasta, potatoes, fruits, milk, etc. But it's important to note that you can look at net carbs, and not everybody does this on keto. So if you're looking at carbs on vegetables, and you look at pull it up on a website, and you're looking at the nutrition facts for broccoli or spinach or something like this, you'll see that there's whatever the carbohydrate number is for that serving that you're looking at. You can subtract the fiber, and that will give you net carbs. We highly recommend this. We, being Dr. Ethan and I, highly recommend this, and that's going to give you room for a lot more vegetables if you're following that keto diet. Quite frankly, one of the things that breaks my heart is when someone is following a keto diet and they're counting their stalks of asparagus or limiting how much spinach they have or how much broccoli they have because they don't want to exceed that 20 grams of carbs for the day. So be aware that you can look at that as, and we recommend to look at that as 20 grams of net carbs. So subtract that fiber, especially from those vegetables, and that's going to give you a lot more space, a lot more wiggle room numbers wise to get those vegetables. So the other thing when you're looking at net carbs is you can subtract things like sugar alcohols. So one of the products that I love, there's a sweetener called Swerve. It's actually based here in New Orleans, but it is available nationally. It's available through Canada. And Swerve is a sweetener that is an erythritol-based natural plant-based sweetener. And erythritol has zero glycemic impact. It has zero carbohydrate impact. And so if you're using erythritol in a product like Swerve in baking, for example, and you're calculating your macronutrients, you see your carbohydrates, you'll see your fiber. You can also subtract all of the grams of erythritol or Swerve from that. So if you're looking at recipes online, you'll see that too. Well, that doesn't seem to make sense. That's, I've got my total carbs, I subtracted my fiber, but they're saying net carbs is a lot lower. That's probably because they're also subtracting that erythritol. So that could be almost a whole nother podcast, is counting net carbs. But just as a side note, when you're looking at limiting your carb intake to 20 grams a day or less, subtracting that fiber, subtracting sugar alcohols like Swerve or erythritol can really open the door to have a lot more flexibility, a lot more volume, and also incorporating a lot more of those nutrient-dense vegetables. So keto diet, 20 grams typically of carbs or less, somewhat limited protein. The keto diet definitely isn't a high protein, low carb diet. The amount of protein needed will vary. So again, Dr. Ethan will speak more to this in just a bit, but if you're checking your ketones, you can kind of play around with how much protein can you have and still stay in ketosis. And so you may be dropping your protein much lower than needed, and you could edge it up just a bit, add some fish in there, add some lean, other types of lean protein. And that will help us to not only lose muscle mass, it'll add more variety to your diet, And you can kind of play around with how much you can have and still stay in ketosis. And then the third component is fats, and that basically makes up the rest. That's the wild card that varies by amounts depending on appetite, depending on calorie needs. So this can include animal fats like butter or heavy cream, for example, but my preference is to include more plant-based fats like coconut oil, olive oil, even something like mayonnaise is heavily centered on plant-based fats. So there's keto calculators online that can help you figure out your macronutrient goals for carbs, protein, fat. There is a keto blogger and cookbook author. Her name is Maria Emmerich. She has a really easy to use version on her website. It's mariamindbodyhealth.com. You can just search keto calculator and it makes it super easy. She also has a ton of recipes that are keto friendly. And on a side note, Swerve that I mentioned also has a ton of recipes, and that is swervesweet.com. And we'll put the link to both of these in our podcast notes as well. So that's kind of a rundown of what makes up a keto diet. And the keto diet can be challenging. It can feel more like science than really eating and dining and enjoying our food. But once you kind of get into the groove of it, it can be easier to follow. And it's so much easier now than it was a decade ago because there's so many more keto-friendly products available. Things like we just mentioned, Swerve, for example. There's more keto-friendly products, recipes. There's low-carb wraps, noodles, potato alternatives. Nut flours like almond flour, coconut flour can be really keto-friendly in baking. So there's so many ways that we can still incorporate a wide variety of nutrient-rich foods and textures and kind of the enjoyment of eating, but still keeping our carbs low. So again, my approach typically is not to recommend a keto diet, but if somebody is doing a keto diet, I like to at least make sure that we're having lots of vegetables in there, keeping our the fats, emphasizing plant-based fats, and including as much of a variety as we can, and trying to kind of stay as normal feeling in food and still being able to enjoy meals with our family that kind of look like the same meals that our family's having. So that's my take on it. I think that you'll also enjoy hearing Dr. Ethan Weiss's take. He is a cardiologist and professor at UC San Fran, and I had the opportunity to sit down with him. And we've talked a lot about keto, a lot of his approach and philosophy about keto as a cardiologist and his opinion and his take. So here's a snapshot from our conversation. All right, so we're here with Dr. Ethan Weiss. He is an associate professor of cardiovascular research at UC San Francisco and does a host of things, including still sees patients, does academic research, and serves as a consultant for a lot of different organizations dealing with keto, cardiovascular, and oversees a lot of different studies and research. So really just a wealth of knowledge on this topic. So I'm really excited to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Molly. I'm excited to be here.
And so kind of just diving right in, well, I guess just give us a kind of a overview of the different aspects of research that you're involved with, what you're doing clinically, what you're doing academically, around just wellness in general, but also as it relates to keto.
Well, so I do, I spend my day, or I should say, I spend my week kind of doing three different main things. One of them, and the most important, is taking care of patients. And I do that mostly in the outpatient setting. So I'm a practicing cardiologist, and my clinical specialty is prevention. So, as I explain that to people, that means if you've had a heart attack, I try and keep you from having a second one. If you haven't had one, I try and keep you from having a first. And we obviously spend a lot of time thinking about traditional cardiovascular risk factors like lipids and cholesterol and metabolism, diabetes, things like that. I also have a research program, and it's mostly lab-based with a lot of work in animal models, mostly mice, but we also have a growing interest in human research and their focus on nutrition and metabolism, specific interest in obesity and type 2 diabetes. And then the third part of my job is not really my job, but as a side exercise, I do consult with a bunch of different companies who are interested in trying to develop solutions for people, either in the nutrition, wellness, weight loss, obesity, diabetes space, somewhere in that range. So that's kind of how I spend my time.
Which is a really fantastic way to be able to kind of spread these different passions out. And, I think that it sounds like a really perfect balance of academic clinical, and then also being able to working with the companies really kind of helps to broaden that on and even a bigger scale to touch even more people. So I think that sounds so well rounded.
Well, it's fun. It's fun because just real quick, it's fun because things move at a very different pace in academia as opposed to in private industry, and it's kind of fun for me to try and wear two different hats and see how things operate in these two different realms.
And it's totally different ways, I'm sure, that you have to even have conversations, like probably even the inflection you use and how quickly you speak probably are very
Yeah,
different.
for sure,
That's
for
really cool.
sure.
So with keto, what's been your work with this as far as research, as far as with patients, kind of where are you with that before we even dive into about keto?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I remember first hearing about it or hearing about sort of the predecessor, I guess, which was really the Atkins diet back in the early, 2000s, and being extremely skeptical. My dad is a cardiologist, so I always tell people I'm a second generation cardiologist, and I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, and at that time, cardiologists and doctors in the world all kind of saw nutrition in the same way, which was that you increase your risk of having a heart attack by having anything that looked like a fat. So my home as a kid had nothing that even resembled fat. So we had non-fat dairy. If we had dairy at all, we had egg beaters, we had margarine, we had, canola oil. We didn't have anything that looked at all like fat.
Where did you
And
grow up? What part of the country?
I grew up in Baltimore, and I don't think I understood it at the time, but I've now come to understand that nutrition is a zero sum game, right? So if you decrease the intake of one macronutrient, you're going to automatically increase the intake of the others if you're keeping calories the same. So what I realized now in looking back on my childhood was that I ate a lot of crap. I mean, I ate a lot of sugar and a lot of very carbohydrate rich snacks, and never thought anything other than I was doing the right thing, the healthy thing. And so then I heard about this Atkins thing, and I didn't really understand it. It definitely set off a bunch of triggers that were from my childhood and from my dad that made me think, gosh, this can't be good for your heart, this has to be risky. And didn't pay a ton of attention to it until probably about 5 years ago. um, it was sort of came to my attention in a bunch of different ways, and then really did a deep dive when I started to advise a company here in San Francisco called Verta Health that's been using low carb ketogenic diets to treat patients with type 2 diabetes. And I joined their advisory board and really started to kind of understand the history and do a very sort of significant dig into the biology and to the clinical literature and everything else. And so that's sort of how I got reintroduced to it. And I have to say, when I started, and I do give them credit for asking me to join their advisory board as sort of a novice and potentially as a skeptic, because I did come at it from a perspective of still kind of thinking this can't be right. So I didn't come at it, as somebody who was a true believer at that time.
And I totally get what you're saying because we're about the same age. I grew up in the 70s, 80s, and my dad wasn't a cardiologist, but otherwise I would say we may have the same one because it was, skim milk, grape nuts, everything that was grainy and fat free was good, and if something had fat in it, it was obviously not, but we prided ourselves on the fact that it was not, that it was fat free. And, everything immediately got that kind of check of approval. And I think, that was largely why you went into cardiology. It's largely why I went into nutrition, was the influence of our parents. And so I kind of relate that we grew up with this very, influenced mindset of one way. And so it seems like a really drastic swing. So I completely can relate to having that skepticism for it.
Yes, it was definitely unnatural, and uh, it took and probably still continues to take some level of adjustment. I think we have these very strongly ingrained beliefs, and nutrition, as you know, as well as anyone else, is one of these things where people just have really strong, powerful personal beliefs, and we as human beings get to choose our own path in terms of what we do from a nutrition standpoint. As much as anything else, I think we have this amazing control to be able to choose what we eat and when we eat and all that stuff. And so it is a complicated world, and people have very ingrained beliefs, strong beliefs, biases. Definitely informs everything I think about going forward. Is I want to try and be thoughtful that we don't repeat some of the mistakes I think we made as a health community over the past 30 years in thinking about nutrition.
And so, with that being said, I think for someone listening, I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of keto, but I don't know that everyone really knows what keto is. And I think a lot of people's concept of what it is really isn't it. So, for those listening, kind of what's your definition of how you easily describe what keto is?
Yeah, so the name keto or ketogenic is it exists because we have this sort of built-in evolutionarily conserved protective mechanism to keep us from starving to death that all other mammals have, which is that we carry around this fat, and the fat that we have on our bodies is really there for two purposes. Probably in the old days, thousands of years ago, served the first purpose was to help protect us from the elements, to keep us warm. But as we've sort of started to wear clothes and don't need that as much, the second part is there too, and that is that it's basically an energy reserve. It's storage of energy when you can't find it. Right? We didn't evolve in an era when there were refrigerators or preservatives, so you'd eat when you could find food, and sometimes it would be days or weeks. And we know from studies that have been done over the past 50 or 60 years that human beings can survive a very long time without food. So I think the longest lived survivor has been over a year, and that is possible because we have this fat, and fat can be itself used as a fuel by some tissues, but certain tissues, and most notably the brain, can't use fat and can only use glucose. So we have this mechanism where we can turn fat into glucose, or sorry, into an alternative fuel source, and that source is a chemical ketones, and those are made in the liver, and they're made as a breakdown product of fat. So when you burn fat, people talk about burning fat as fuel. That process results in production of these chemicals called ketones, which are made in the liver, and they can go on and provide a fuel source to organs like your brain or your heart or other organs when you're short on food. And so the diet came about when people realized that if you trick your body by restricting the amount of carbohydrates you eat, so again, we had three macronutrients, so carbohydrates, protein, and fats. So if you restrict the amount of carbohydrate you eat down to very close to zero, your body believes that it's starving, and so it goes into this same pathway that you would if you actually were starving, and you start making ketones. So that's kind of the origin of the word keto or ketogenic diet. And in practice, what it means is you're cutting back on your intake of carbohydrates and replacing those calories with fat calories. So you're keeping your protein intake about the same and basically trading all of what you would have been eating in the carbohydrate column for fat.
And a lot of people would need to also drop their protein intake, correct? Because protein can be converted into glucose. So, in order to stay in kind of that ketosis, if someone has a very high protein diet, they might need to drop that as well.
True, absolutely. So and I think there are two things, right? So that's an interesting point. And one thing is that typically when people start keto or they start low carb diets and they have trouble getting in, if they're measuring ketones and they want to try and get into ketosis, one of the biggest pitfalls that people run into is that they have a hard time eating as much fat as they need to. And so what they do is, instead of taking all the carbs and putting into the fat column, they actually increase their protein intake. And you're absolutely right that protein will turn on glucose production in the liver and will bump you out of ketosis. For certain people who are on a very strict ketogenic diet, so ketogenic diets are used in certain medical instances, most notably in kids with epilepsy. And for those kids who really are sensitive to even the slightest bit and really depend on high levels of ketones in their blood, they will have to cut their protein intake. But most normal people who are eating roughly 30% of their calories as protein don't need to cut protein. They just can't add it.
Right. I see a lot of restaurant menus, tout that they have a keto approved dish or whatever, but it'll really be, a lot of times it's salmon or, some other types of fish or even lean protein and veg. And, my opinion on that is that's not necessarily a keto plate. It's a low carb plate, because it's still a relatively lean, higher protein than anything on that plate. So I think a lot of people think they're doing true keto. They're not measuring ketones. They're not checking to see if they're in ketosis. They're really just doing low carb.
that's true. And I think, one of the things, and we'll probably touch on this later, one of the things that's interesting is that you can sort of ascribe or subscribe to a sort of arbitrary set of rules about how to do a diet. Or, one of the advantages of doing keto is that you can actually measure whether you're making these ketones. You can measure ketones through a bunch of different methods. So, and everybody's biology is different, depends on a lot of different things that we do understand and some that we don't. And so, if for you or me, it may be very different. Like I may be able to get away with, say more protein or a little bit less fat, whereas you may need, more fat and less protein. And, everybody's going to have a different tolerance for all the different things.
And when we're
Uh,
saying the low carb approach with keto, it's very low carb. So it's about 5 to 10% of someone's daily calories, which for a lot of people might be 20 to 40 to 50 grams of carbs. And there's a lot of, a lot of vegetables might quickly kind of inch into this carb range for people. So if you're listening to this and you think, well, what is really low carb? 20 to 40 or 50 grams a day is really low. When you look at a slice of bread, might have 15 or 20 just in that single slice. So with that, and when we're looking at true keto being that very low carb, moderate protein, and then high fat, how do you, as a cardiologist, like how do you feel about the saturated fat? Especially a lot of people will reach for the animal-based saturated fats as part of keto as it relates to heart health. Kind of what's your, because that's definitely something that keto gets beat up a lot for is, the butters, the heavy creams that so many people choose. I like to kind of look at more of the plant-based emphasis when people are going the keto route, but I know that that's not often the case.
So yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple of things that I think are really important. One is there's this sort of this difference between carbs and net carbs, and I don't think um, it's too important to get into the details, but I'm a big believer in net carbs because I don't think we should ever tell people not to be eating vegetables. I do think there are probably some vegetables that may be better or worse. For example, like carrots are pretty rich in carbohydrate, whereas broccoli or cauliflower has a little bit less, at least in terms of the response you get
Mm-hmm.
from glucose. So I do think I'm a big believer in eat as much vegetable, eat as much vegetables that grow. We always talk about vegetables that grow above the ground or vegetables that grow below the ground. And so from my perspective, eat as much vegetables that grow above the ground as you can all the time, and don't worry about how many carbs. Don't even look at the carbohydrate content.
Which warms
Some
my
people
heart
talk.
because I think that is one of the things that just makes me cringe. With keto, I really like that it absolutely heightens people's awareness of carbs, sugar. It has them reading labels. It has them dialing back on all this stuff that they probably should be dialing back on. But it kills me when I hear someone debating whether or not they want to eat asparagus or spinach because of the carbs in it. And it's like, that didn't get anybody into any of the trouble that they're in,
Not at all. I
Yeah.
totally agree, and I think that's one area that I really want to emphasize to people. In terms of the heart health, listen, this is an area we could probably spend 4 hours talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and I've talked about this in different interviews and online and this and that, and there is I think I have an explanation for why it exists the way it does, but there is this perception out there among hardcore keto advocates that that some of the sort of things that traditionally we've thought about in cardiology are not important, and specifically the big one that comes up all the time is cholesterol. And there is this definite phenomenon where some percentage of people, be it 20 or 30% of people who go on keto, uh, will have a pretty scary and dramatic increase in their bad, what we used to call bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol. And there's a big debate about what that means. And the truth is, we really don't know what it means. We don't know that going on a low carb, high fat diet, that a ketogenic diet, and having an increase in your LDL cholesterol is necessarily increasing your risk of having a heart attack. The problem is we don't have the studies that show it's safe, and so you're making a bet, and that bet you may not find out the answer for 20 or 30 years, and at that point it may be too late. So what I encourage people to do is not ignore a 25 or 30 years worth of literature about the risks of high cholesterol, and take some steps to at least consider that cholesterol may be a problem. And I think we can talk about my strategies, but the big thing for me is if you're one of these people who can eat as much saturated fat as possible and nothing happens to your cholesterol, then I'm pretty strongly a believer that you can do whatever you want to do and don't don't have to worry. However, if you're one of these people who goes on a low carb, high fat diet with that's heavily animal based and high in saturated fat, and you also happen to have an increase in bad cholesterol, then I think it's worth at least exploring a few options to try to address that. And I have, again, I have a handful of things that I recommend to my patients and other people about trying to do kind of what we would think of as like a little bit more of a heart healthy keto approach, which ultimately you've sort of tipped, which is doing a little bit more plant based as opposed to animal based and more unsaturated, especially mono and omega-3 polyunsaturated fats as opposed to saturated fats.
And then, like you said, everything, all the vegetables above the ground, not limiting that.
Yep.
Well, I think what you said is brought up something for people to think of. I think a lot of us, we think, oh, I'm going to start doing keto, and then we make the decision and we start it tomorrow, and maybe give it a little bit and kind of think it through and make it your own self experiment. And if you are going to go a route of something like keto or another plan that you're deciding, get that full workup of blood work done at the beginning. And then would you say 3 months in, or what would your recommendation be?
Yeah, I think 3 months is probably the right number. Again, I want to be super careful to state clearly that we just don't have the answers. But in that time, until we have the answers, and we'd all like to do the clinical trials and demonstrate, whether it's safe or whether it's dangerous. But until that time, we kind of have to make the best judgment that we can with the information we have. So I think you're absolutely right. Get a baseline set of numbers, and then probably 2 or 3 months in, check. And again, 70% of people are going to have nothing to worry about. It's going to be that 20 or 30% of people who are going to have the problem. And there are options. I just want to make sure everyone understands there are options. I think one of the options being to not do keto, but I don't want people to take away from this conversation that that's the only option. That is certainly an option, but I don't believe it's the only option.
And so before we switch gears to that, if someone does say, okay, I want to run my numbers and kind of get that baseline, what's kind of your quick rundown for them to get note of and to have in that baseline?
Oh, wow. So I think I want to be careful not to give too much like medical advice, but I think, first of all, anytime anyone takes on any significant nutrition or dietary change, I do recommend at least discussing it with your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate stepping on other doctors' toes about what's important to them. But if you were my patient, say hypothetically, I have a sort of set of blood tests that I do, and I'm starting to at the beginning at least, look at this more advanced lipid profile. And I do that just once at the beginning to see if it correlates with the traditional lipid profile. And if it does, then there's no need to continue to do that again. But there are some things you might miss in just sort of a traditional lipid profile, which gives you total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, and triglycerides. So for my patients, I do an advanced lipid profile, which gives me a few more numbers to look at a baseline. And then if everything correlates and is lined up, then I probably just continue along with that basic cholesterol panel.
And would you recommend any types of inflammatory markers or something like that to look at before and after?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is if you look at the data, most, there was a study that was actually published by Virta Health, and I wasn't involved in it per se, but I did review it, and I've been advising that company. And if you look, they looked at the 31 or 32, I believe, cardiovascular risk markers in people who were doing their program, which is a ketogenic diet. Their population was patients with type 2 diabetes. And I think of the 31 markers, 30 of them moved in the right direction. So they moved in a favorable direction, including markers of inflammation like CRP. So I think the data strongly suggests that most of the markers move in the right direction in almost, all the people. The one marker, of course, that moved in the wrong direction was LDL cholesterol, that bad cholesterol. So I think that's what everyone spends their time focusing on. It might be worth it to get a CRP at baseline just kind of for fun, but the expectation is that it would move in the correct direction, as would glucose and hemoglobin A1C and fasting insulin and all the other markers, which if you want to, if you're one of these people who likes to, do these N-of-1 experiments and measure a bunch of things, then by all means, take a look.
I love that. I think it's, I encourage my clients to do it. I encourage my readers to do it. I think it's just a really neat thing that if you're going to take something on, to kind of make it, even if it's just your own personal self-experiment. So advanced lipid panel, CRP is C-reactive protein, which is a marker of inflammation, and then hemoglobin A1C, glucose. So that would just be just for our listeners to kind of have that takeaway. So kind of getting that baseline, and then you would be able to see, are you one of these who has, that what might be that high LDL response. And then you would consider, okay, shifting to maybe a different style of keto or more of that plant-based style, which is, as you were saying, the fish oils, coconut oils, plant-based oils, avocado, olive oil, etc.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just say, in the spirit of full disclosure, I've been doing keto, or the sort of whatever you want to call modified keto, for 14 months myself, and I've had an amazing time with it, and feel as good as I have really since I was in high school physically. And I eat mostly sort of plant based. I wouldn't say completely. I eat fish, and I'll eat meat from time to time, but most of the source of fat for me comes from the things you just described. So it's lots of nuts, lots of avocado, lots of fish. That's sort of where I get the majority of my fat. I do eat a fair amount of cheese, which I love, and I think there's a debate among my nutrition colleagues about whether cheese sort of has the same effects on cholesterol as other sources of saturated fat. But I do really enjoy eating cheese.
And so I think kind of that, I call it keto light. So I like that. With the benefits of keto, can you speak some to the impact of the keto diet with that sharp reduction in carbohydrates and its effect on inflammation and what that means full body, and then also insulin and what that means full body?
Yeah, I mean, the inflammation stuff is super interesting, and I think it's an area that everybody would love to study more. I think the observation is that people who go on these diets have a decrease in circulating markers of inflammation, which I should sort of back up and say that there's this one marker we were talking about, CRP, is strongly associated with risk of cardiovascular disease or heart attack. So there were studies that were done back in the 1990s that showed that people who had elevated levels of CRP, this inflammation marker, were at increased risk of developing heart attacks. And so that's been a marker that people have been paying a lot of attention to. And so people tend to believe that things you do that bring your CRP down might improve your risk of heart attack. And it turns out that keto or low carb diets actually really do dramatically reduce circulating levels of CRP in most people. So that's something I think that we're all excited to test. We don't know directly about the link to risk of cardiovascular disease or heart attacks, but it's something that's super tantalizing.
And so when we think of inflammation, there's always the first thing I think that comes to a lot of people's mind is joints. But then on that more cellular level, that inflammation is linked to a whole host of things, from cardiovascular disease to brain disease, Alzheimer's, dementia. So anything that we can do to reduce that inflammation in our body, the better. And I think it's one of those things that we hear that sugar is inflammatory, but it's really hard to really believe it until we start to cut these things out and really feel the benefits. I was actually just today, like less than an hour before we sat down to do this podcast, I was speaking with a friend of mine, and he had cut out sugar. It's here in New Orleans. We just came off of Lent. So post Mardi Gras, everybody kind of does their cleansing, whether they're Catholic or not. Everybody does something for Lent. And he had given up sugar, and he was stunned that his shoulder problems and his knee problems were just like completely gone, and completely shocked that giving up the sugar and the white carbs had made this much of a difference. And so I think it's very much one thing we read it, it's another thing when we feel it. And how about the effect of insulin and having such suppressed levels of insulin, and kind of the benefit that can have for full body, for brain health with keto?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of things we could talk about, but if you go back in time, the earliest publications I could find on what we now call a ketogenic diet come from the 1700s. And at that time, doctors were using and publishing these diets to treat patients with type 2 diabetes, and they were doing it to great effect. It was not easy, and they had a hard time keeping people on the diets. They had to kind of put them in the hospital and feed them because it was difficult to do. But there was good evidence, even several hundred years ago, that reducing your intake of carbohydrates would have a positive impact on your overall body metabolism. We now know that the mechanism for that is probably through the reduction of insulin, and that occurs through an improvement in what we call insulin sensitivity, which just means that the insulin you have in your body works better, and so it's more efficient, so your pancreas doesn't have to make as much. Insulin's a growth factor. It's known to be, or thought to be, important in cancer and other diseases, inflammation, and so I think everybody who I know in biology and medicine believes that if you can get insulin down, obviously not if you have type 1 diabetes, but if you can get circulating levels of insulin down, it's good for you overall. And in fact, if you look across all studies that have ever been done on longevity in animal models, whether it's a worm or a fly or a mouse, the one common thread is that it seems like a reduction in insulin levels confers an increased lifespan. And those trials haven't been done in people yet, but that's something I think that we all look at as being one of the biggest and most positive effects of these diets, is that you reduce your levels of insulin.
And I think that's a good takeaway for people, even if they say, okay, I'm not going to go, full keto. I'm going to do keto light. I'll do more plant-based. I might have some more carbs in there and have the vegetables. If you go from a high carb and especially a high refined starch diet, and you're even just cutting out those white breads, those starches, the sugars, automatically just with that step, you're reducing that circulating insulin. And so we're making it easier for our body to actually use fat as energy versus storing fat. And there's this, you mentioned that with this in the 1700s with treating diabetes. One of the things that blows my mind is that so many of the plans, the nutrition plans for people with diabetes, have so many carbs built in, and plans by health professionals that are my peers. And we have, very strong disagreements about it, that why would we give this person who's very sedentary and obese this many carbs, and only to be matching it by giving them this much more insulin? Why don't we dial back their carbs and then dial back the insulin that we're having to give them? And it continues to be a circular conversation that blows my mind.
Well, and if you look at the Verna Health study, that's to me is one of the most striking and impressive things that they found, was that patients came off all of their diabetes medicines, but particularly they were reducing the amount of insulin that they were using, which, as you know, is, it's one of these circular things where the more insulin you use, the more fat you're putting on and the more insulin resistant you get, and it becomes one of these like bad vicious cycles. So that's a big benefit.
And we can put the link to that study the studies plural that you're referencing. We can put the link to that in our podcast notes. So I think big takeaway for our listeners right here too is, even if you're not going that full keto, dialing back those white carbs, dialing back the starchy carbs and processed sugars, that's going to be huge step in the right direction. So one of the things, I think, shifting gears a bit, is when we look at keto, I have a lot of friends, readers, people in the community, clients who will share that they've tried or they've done or they're doing keto. And a lot of times they see weight loss. But what I also see is when we look at their body composition and we're measuring their body composition, I'm also seeing a muscle loss. Is that something that you see as a frequent negative effect of keto?
I haven't seen it, and in the studies that I've looked at that are well done, there isn't what I see to be a significant muscle loss. There's obviously a huge fat loss, but I haven't seen it in terms of muscle loss. I think, again, a lot of that will depend on people's level of physical activity and what else they're doing. And then, of course, protein. I think if they are not overly restricting protein, there should be no reason to waste muscle. It would be unusual if you keep your protein level adequate.
So I think that brings us to another good point is, if someone is trying to do keto diet, talk to me about the different ways that someone can see if they are in ketosis, because I think that's something that the people who are in my head that I'm thinking of specifically have gone very, very low carb, very, very, very low carb, high fat, but also very low protein in order to get into and stay in ketosis. So if they were tracking that on a regular basis and they saw, okay, I could raise my protein up a bit and still stay in ketosis, I think that would be beneficial. And that might help to offset that muscle loss that we're seeing. So what are the different ways that someone can track and see if they're in ketosis?
Yeah, so it's actually, to me, it's one of the big advantages of this diet over almost any other diet. And that's specifically what I mean by that, is that it allows you to track a biomarker to see how you're doing. And there's just no other diet like that. So you can, if you're doing it right by whether or not your body's making ketones. And there are effectively 3 different ways to measure ketones. You can measure them in the blood, and you can go on Amazon.com and buy a blood ketone meter and measure it. The advantage of that is that it's pretty proven and mostly accurate, at least some of the devices. The disadvantage is that it's expensive and it's painful, and people don't like to prick their fingers and They don't like
You got to really want it. Yeah.
blood. Yeah, so that's one, that's sort of the serious biohackers, the ones who've been doing keto the longest are the ones who use their, blood meters. The other sort of common way that people who are just sort of casual keto people will measure ketones is in the urine. So there are strips that you can pee on. And again, the advantage is it's relatively easy. The disadvantage is it's kind of messy and like people don't love to like be
Right.
messing with their own pee all the time. And the other serious disadvantage is they're just not that accurate. So it's not the best way. So the third method is through breath, and breath ketone measurements, or it's actually technically acetone, which is the chemical they use for nail polish
Hmm.
remover. That's Those methods have been around for over 100 years. There are publications from the 1920s talking about using breath acetone measurements to track ketosis. Um, Full disclosure, a company that I've recently co-founded makes a device that you can blow into to measure your ketone or acetone levels in breath, and so we're out in the market now and using that to help enable people to kind of track and maintain ketosis. And we think that affords a lot of advantages and kind of steers away from some of the disadvantages of the other methods. But any method really can work.
And I saw it online. It's really cool. It looks like a breathalyzer, like you would blow into for alcohol. How does it compare in terms of accuracy and precision to a blood test?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up all the time. And so first of all, I'll say it looks like an alcohol breathalyzer because it really is. Ours is not. So we actually changed the sensor out for a sensor that's more specific for acetone, but it's the same exact technology. And in fact, company that we partnered with to make ours had been making an alcohol breathalyzer. So it's the technical term for it is that you're sensing volatile organic compounds. Ethanol, which is alcohol, and acetone are both volatile organic compounds. In terms of the accuracy, I can't give you uh, an answer in terms of I can point to a clinical trial that shows the accuracy because frankly we don't know. And the reason we don't know is that there are just significant biological differences between the way acetone behaves and the way beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the ketone that's measured in blood tests. There's a lot of differences in terms of how they're produced and how they're cleared and which tissues and organs use them for fuel. So we're still in an early learning phase. I can tell you that in general, they track very closely that our device is, and I probably tested myself, I don't know, 10,000 times with both devices. Our device is directionally very similar. So when your ketone levels are high by blood, they're high by breath. There are some differences in kinetics, meaning like it looks like the blood test is a little bit more quickly responsive, whereas the breath test may take a little bit of a lag. So there may be, if you have a carbohydrate rich dinner, you may not see that difference until the following afternoon in breath, whereas you'd see it that next morning for blood. But this is an area that we're still sort of actively exploring in terms of that specific, question of like how the two compare. And there are a lot of differences in terms of the two molecules.
And so, giving it a plug, can you share the name and the website if anybody's interested?
Yeah, sure. We got really imaginative with our name. The name of the company is Keto, but it's spelled Keyto, and the website is getketo.com. And it's fun. I've never done anything like this before on my own. It's been kind of an adventure to learn this different, this business world and think about developing a product. And so far, the feedback has been really positive from our users. We have, I think we've sold, something like 12 or 13,000 of these devices. And so we got a lot of them out there in the world, and we're hearing great things and excited to keep working on it and see if we can help people. Basically, to me, the advantage of this is that instead of getting a prescription from me or from you about what to eat and what relative ratios of macros or other things to eat, people are going to have the freedom with the device like this to be able to explore what works for them individually on a sort of personalized level. And so I love this concept of personalized nutrition. So it's a way for people to really learn, well, I can eat this or I can't eat that, or where are the hidden carbs, and what about sauces, and what about soups, and what about salad dressings, other places where you might never expect to find sugar or hidden carbs, and you all of a sudden discover them.
And how you're responding to it. And you guys
Yep.
have a corresponding app that does it help people track carbs, or does it help them see foods that are keto friendly?
Yeah, so one of the principles of this company was that we wanted to do something that would be real world and sustainable. And so from our perspective, tracking either calories or macros is not sustainable. And so we really designed the program to be something that people would do without having to track what they eat. The app gives basically a set of resources so that you can search through as you're learning, what is the carbohydrate content of raspberries versus
Mm-hmm.
apples. So, so if you search and there's a little, section on the app where you can put in apple and it'll tell you there are 25 grams of net carbs in an apple versus, whatever 3 grams in a, 20 raspberries. So it's a way for you to learn about what you can
Great.
eat.
So
And
you
then
look at one food and it'll tell you, and then it'll give you suggestions for similar but better.
that's right.
I love
Yep.
that.
And then we also have some, some menu options. We have some shopping lists. We're working on trying to develop some of our own foods, and we're going to distribute other people's sort of keto friendly foods. And then the last thing that I think is really super important is that there's an element of the app where people can get into a group and get some social support, which I think is something that's really critical in a experience like this, is that you have other people around to help who've done it before, who can help guide you, in terms of thinking, where you're going to get in trouble and, where certain things work well and where they don't.
And can people access the app if they don't have the keto breathalyzer?
As of as of today, yeah.
Okay.
In the future, probably not. In the
Okay.
future, it's probably going to be all linked to one
Yeah.
thing.
Okay.
But I
That's
think,
cool.
yep,
And so let's talk about net carbs for just a minute. So if someone's not familiar, what net carbs basically is you take your total carbs, you subtract your fiber, and that's net carbs. You also can subtract sugar alcohols. And so there's products like Truvia or Swerve. Swerve is actually a sweetener company that's based here in New Orleans. So we use their product for everything, all and different products that we'll develop or recipes, etc. But the erythritol has effectively zero net carbs. And so if you're working with a recipe and you're calculating the carbs from it, you would see your total carbs, you subtract your fiber, and you subtract all the carbs that Swerve or whatever that erythritol source provided. So to your point earlier, when someone is agonizing over how do I stay under 20 grams of carbs, there's a big difference between 20 grams of total carbs and 20 grams of net carbs once you subtract fiber, and then also once you subtract the sugar alcohols or erythritol that might be in some of these plant-based natural sweeteners. And so I think to that point, if someone's thinking about, okay, whether they're thinking about going keto or they're thinking about going that plant-based keto, or even just kind of dialing back their carb intake or sugar intake, are there certain just big picture things? I have a few that immediately come to mind that are those easy swaps for people to start making, like going from regular cow's milk to unsweetened almond milk or coconut milk or
sure. I
others.
mean, those are good ones. I mean, I think from my perspective, it's just about, where are you gonna. I always think of it as you have a budget of kind of how many carbs you can eat during the
Mm-hmm.
day. And again, I sort of tell people to ignore fiber. It's good for you, and eat as much of it as you can. So that's why this net carb thing, I think, to me is a great way to look at things. But I don't want people to have to get out a calculator and start
Mm-hmm.
tracking. So from my perspective, it's really just about trying to kind of maximize as much of that good, fiber rich vegetables, and then making sure you eat enough good healthy fat, and go from there.
So I think if someone is, okay, well, what do I do about? Because people have their things that they're like. I had a guy one time. He ate a bagel every morning, and when we were discussing what are we going to do instead of the bagel, I thought tears were going to come to his eyes. People just they have this emotional attachment to so many of the foods, and a lot of times there are these carb rich foods because they bring them, such an emotional comfort a lot of times. And so looking at things and saying, okay, what are the different replacers or things? I'm not a big, I don't advocate that people eat gluten free because gluten is inherently bad. But I do like a lot of the gluten free flours, like an almond flour or coconut flour. If someone's into baking, that can be a really easy way to make foods that taste, like your normal baked sweets. But with almond flour, coconut flour, you're really sharply reducing your carbs. You don't have those white processed carbs. You have more proteins, more fats, more fiber. And so, starting to kind of play around with some things like that and taking a step back and, like Ethan said, of looking at what is your total carb intake for the day, and tracking it for a few days. And sometimes it can be eye opening to see, wow, I was having oatmeal and toast and some fruit or juice, and it's carb, carb, carb. So what can we kind of
Yeah.
start to do instead? And so I think I'm happy to hear about the app, and that it kind of gives suggestion and guidance. And of course, meeting with someone who's a nutrition professional, a lot of registered dietitians, even though that may not be the first line that they would recommend of doing a keto or a version of keto diet, our team of dietitians, if you come into us and you're doing a program and you have your mindset on that, we want to help and guide and support that. So, working with a health professional too to help find that. And then I think finally, kind of the last thing, whether someone loves or hates keto, I think a big factor to keep in mind, regardless, is behavior change. And you're a big advocate of that, of how something like the keto diet can be that educational tool and ultimately lead to that reset of patterns.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what it comes down to for me is if you step back and ask sort of why we have had such a hard time with helping people lose weight, over this past 25 and 30 years when our country has just gained so much weight. To me, it's easy to blame individual people and say that it's, people are weak and they have no discipline. I hate that. I think what's happened is we put people in a different food environment than we've been in ever. We have more easy, cheap, readily available, highly processed and calorie dense foods that you can get almost anywhere you are at all times. And so how do we get out of that? To me, one of the paths away from that is giving people information that they can use to act on and to actually change their behavior in a sustainable way. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot. And so what people use typically is their bathroom scale. And unfortunately, that changes so slowly that it just doesn't end up being useful as a tool for behavior change. So that's why I'm excited about our keto device, our sensor, because it does give you sort of actionable information that you can use to make changes and learn in a relatively short period of time. I think other people are using continuous glucose monitors for the same kinds of purpose, and that's something I think that also has a lot of promise. But I think the idea is that we have to give people the information that they need to be able to make the smart, informed choices around food to live in this environment that really is toxic.
And I think a lot of times I see people use keto as that starting point. They see a big shift in weight, and they a lot of times if they had a lot to lose, it can give them that motivation. And then it's super educational to them of what has carbs, what has sugar, and they start to find these other replacers, and so they can live their life and be happy with their food choices, but they found these other better for them choices. So big takeaways are keto. You're hearing it from the cardiologist of the keto. A plant-based keto would be. It sounds like kind of a big takeaway for people to try to shift it in that direction if possible.
Well, so plant-based for sure, but also, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, I love fish, and so
Yeah.
I do think, especially like now when I go to the grocery store, I ask for the fattiest cut of salmon that I can
Oh
get
my
because
god. The
that's
that's the salmon belly on there. It
it's
is
delicious. Yeah,
so good. I ask for
delicious.
whatever piece has the most on that. Absolutely. And I
Exactly.
savor it like,
Yep.
oh, it's so good. Okay.
So good. And I will have you know, bacon and eggs from not every day,
Mhm.
but I'll have bacon and eggs from time to time. And that's not, I am definitely not saying that you can't have any saturated fat. I'm just saying don't go that for me at least, my approach is not to go crazy with the
Mhm.
saturated fats.
And I think just look, the things that you said, avocado, nuts, olive oil, fish, vegetables, it's real whole foods that there's no debate about that.
Yep.
And it's eliminating the things that are causing the inflammation, causing the weight gain, causing that craving roller coaster, that energy roller coaster that we're better without those things anyway. So we will have the links to the studies that you've referenced, the websites that you've referenced, the app as well. And is there anything else that you want us to make sure that we include before we wrap up?
I don't think so. This has been super fun.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. And you've got some other research that'll be coming out fall of 2019 on intermittent fasting, you said. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that and having you back on.
I can't wait.
All right. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye bye.
I'm so grateful to Dr. Ethan for joining us today, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation as much as I did and learned as much as I did. And you can find the links that he mentioned in the show notes of this podcast, including the app that he mentioned, the studies that he mentioned, and the resources to help do keto as healthfully and balanced as possible. If you do decide to try the keto diet, also use it as an opportunity to help break and replace some of those not so good habits and to help educate yourself, learn more about how you might respond to certain foods and ingredients so that you can make lasting behavioral changes that can stick around long after you're off of any particular diet. I'm Molly Kimball, and you've been listening to Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, the podcast. If you would like more Fueled Wellness and Nutrition, head over to mollykimball.com, and you can follow me, Molly Kimball RD, on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another dose of Fueled Wellness and Nutrition. Thanks for listening, and stay focused on living your strongest, healthiest life.